In the last few days, the world has once again started watching a scenario that has repeated itself many times before in the Middle East. Missiles launched into the night. Drones crossing the sky. Entire countries on high alert. Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United States. Tensions are rising again, and every headline seems to suggest the same thing. This situation could grow into something much bigger. But while television channels show explosions, military maps, and political leaders trading accusations, there is another part of the story that people talk about far less. Because every time a conflict appears in this region, the consequences never stay there. Oil prices begin to climb. Gasoline and diesel become more expensive in many countries. Flights are cancelled or suddenly rerouted. Ordinary travelers end up stuck in airports, sometimes forced to deal with the situation on their own. And this raises a question that is rarely asked clearly enough. Who actually pays the real price of these conflicts? In this video, I don't just want to talk about missiles, military strategies, or political tensions. I want to look at what is really happening, why these crises keep appearing, and why their effects eventually reach people all over the world. This is my perspective on what is happening right now in the Middle East. In the last few days, if you have opened the news or scrolled through the internet, you have probably noticed the same thing appearing again and again. Once more, images of missiles, drones, and rising tensions in the Middle East are dominating headlines. Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United States, Israel. The same names keep appearing, and with every new report the situation seems to move one step closer to something bigger. But from my perspective, the problem is that most people only see small pieces of this story. A headline here, a short clip there, a political statement followed immediately by another breaking news update. Everything moves so quickly that it becomes difficult to understand what is really happening behind all these events. Over the past weeks, tensions between Iran and several countries in the Gulf region have been rising again. There have been reports of missile launches and drone attacks, some of them targeting strategic locations, including energy infrastructure and military areas. At the same time, the United States and its allies have started strengthening their military presence in the region. Whenever you start seeing movements like this, it usually means the situation is becoming serious. It is no longer just a diplomatic disagreement or political pressure. It becomes a situation that can escalate very quickly. But what I personally find interesting is the way these events are presented to the public. Most of the time, the story is simplified into something very easy to follow. One country attacks, another responds. One leader makes accusations, another promises retaliation. It almost feels like a script we have seen many times before. Yet the reality is far more complex. The Middle East is one of the most strategically important regions in the world. Not only because of historical conflicts or political rivalries, but because of something even more powerful: energy. Oil and gas from this region fuel entire economies around the planet. And the maritime routes surrounding the Arabian Peninsula are some of the most critical trade corridors in the world. That is why, whenever tensions start rising here, the entire world begins paying attention. Another thing that stands out to me is how quickly global markets react when even the smallest sign of conflict appears. Sometimes an actual war does not even have to begin. It can be enough for tensions to rise, for a missile to be launched, or for a military base to be targeted. And almost immediately the effects begin spreading far beyond the region. Oil prices start climbing. Investors become nervous. Airlines begin rerouting flights away from certain airspaces. Shipping companies start reassessing their routes through key waterways. From my point of view, this shows just how fragile the balance in this region really is. A single incident can trigger a chain reaction that spreads across the global economy. And that is exactly what seems to be happening now. The attacks and military responses reported over the past days have already placed several countries on high alert. Some airspaces are becoming riskier for aviation. Certain trade routes are becoming more complicated. And political tensions continue rising day by day. What makes me think even more about this situation is whether most ordinary people realize how much events like this can affect our everyday lives. Because at first glance, these conflicts seem very far away. They happen in places we usually only hear about through news reports. But in reality, their consequences rarely stay there. They spread outward, often faster than we expect. And that is why I believe it is important not only to look at the missiles, the military movements, or the political speeches, but to step back and look at the bigger picture. Because what is happening right now in the Middle East is not just a regional crisis. It is a situation that can very quickly begin to influence things that most of us normally take for granted. From the price of fuel, to the stability of travel routes, to the overall balance of the global economy. And in many ways, this may only be the beginning of a much larger story. But if we look a little closer at everything that is happening right now, it becomes clear that this situation is not only about missiles, drones, or political tensions between countries. There is another factor that almost always appears in the center of these crises: energy. More specifically, oil. The Middle East is not only a region known for long political rivalries and historical conflicts. It is also one of the most important energy hubs in the entire world. A huge portion of the oil that powers global economies comes directly from this region. And because of that, every time tensions start rising here, the consequences never remain purely political or military. The effects begin spreading almost immediately through the global economy. Sometimes it doesn't even take a full war for this to happen. A single missile launch, a drone strike, or even the threat of blocking a major shipping route can be enough to shake global markets. Investors become nervous. Energy companies become cautious. And oil prices begin to climb. For many people, this might sound like something abstract, something that only affects financial markets or economic charts. But in reality, the consequences reach everyday life very quickly. Because when oil becomes more expensive, almost everything else begins to follow. Gasoline and diesel prices rise. Transportation becomes more expensive. Trucks delivering goods to supermarkets have to pay more for fuel. Airlines burn more fuel when they are forced to reroute flights or avoid certain regions. And all of those costs eventually accumulate. Most people only see the final result. They arrive at a gas station and notice the price has increased again. They try to book a flight and realize the ticket is suddenly much more expensive, or the flight itself has been cancelled. But very few people connect those moments with events that are happening thousands of kilometers away. Another aspect that is often overlooked is the role of global transport routes. When tensions increase in areas like the Persian Gulf, both airlines and shipping companies become extremely cautious. Certain routes are avoided completely. Airplanes reroute around potentially dangerous airspace. Cargo ships sometimes choose longer paths or delay departures until the situation becomes more predictable. These decisions are made for safety, which is understandable. But they also create another consequence. Costs increase. And when transportation costs increase, those expenses eventually reach consumers. From my perspective, this is the part of the story that is often missing from discussions about conflicts like this. Most of the focus goes to military strategies, political alliances, and official statements from governments. But far less attention is given to the real impact on ordinary people. Because while political leaders debate security, influence, and strategic interests, millions of people in completely different parts of the world begin to feel the consequences in very practical ways. At the gas pump, at the supermarket, at the airport. That is why I think it is important to look at situations like this from a wider perspective. Not just as a geopolitical conflict, but as a chain reaction that spreads through the global economy and eventually affects everyday life. Because when a region responsible for a large portion of the world's energy supply becomes unstable, the effects rarely stay contained. They spread. And sometimes they spread much faster than people expect. And that is exactly what we are starting to see happen again. And if we take this discussion one step further, there is a place that almost always comes up whenever tensions rise in the Middle East. A place that, for many people, looks like just a small line on the map. But in reality, it is one of the most important locations for the global economy. The Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway sits between Iran and Oman and connects the Persian Gulf to the open waters of the Indian Ocean. At first glance, it may seem like just another shipping route. But in reality, it is one of the most strategically important energy corridors in the world. Roughly 1/5 of the world's seaborne oil passes through this strait. That means a massive portion of the energy that fuels global economies moves through this relatively narrow passage. Every single day, dozens of enormous oil tankers travel through this area, carrying crude oil from countries such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran to markets across Europe, Asia, and beyond. Because of that, whenever tensions rise in this region, global markets become extremely sensitive. There is always one question that begins to appear. What would happen if this route became unsafe? Iran has repeatedly suggested in the past that, in the event of a major conflict, the Strait of Hormuz could potentially be blocked. Of course, closing such an important route would not be simple and would almost certainly trigger a strong international response. But even the possibility of such a scenario is enough to make global energy markets nervous. Because if oil traffic through this corridor were disrupted, even for a short period of time, the consequences could spread very quickly. Oil prices could surge dramatically. Supply chains could become unstable. Countries that rely heavily on imported energy would feel the pressure almost immediately. From my perspective, this is exactly why this area is watched so closely by major global powers. Naval forces patrol these waters regularly, and every movement in this region is carefully monitored. Because this is not just about regional politics or historical rivalries. It is about one of the most vital energy arteries of the global economy. And that is exactly what makes every incident in this region so concerning. Sometimes it is an attack on an oil tanker. Sometimes it is a drone incident. Other times it may simply be military exercises or political warnings. But the underlying message is always the same. If this route were to be destabilized or blocked, the consequences would not remain confined to the Middle East. They would spread across the world. And perhaps that is why many analysts consider the Strait of Hormuz to be one of the most sensitive geopolitical choke points on the planet. A very small place on the map, but with an enormous impact on the entire world. And at this point, a question begins to appear that more and more people around the world are starting to ask. Is the world slowly moving toward a much larger conflict? Because if we step back and look at the bigger picture, we are not only talking about rising tensions in the Middle East. At the same time, there is another major conflict that has been going on for years now. The war between Russia and Ukraine. This conflict began in 2022, and even though it does not always dominate headlines the way it once did, it is still ongoing today. The front lines still exist, the fighting continues, and the political and economic consequences are still being felt in many parts of the world. From my perspective, when we look at these conflicts separately, they can appear as isolated events. But when we place them next to each other, a much more complex picture begins to emerge. In Europe, we have a war that has already lasted for years between Russia and Ukraine. In the Middle East, we are now seeing rising tensions involving Iran, countries of the Gulf region, and major global powers that are indirectly involved. And naturally, a question begins to surface that many people are now discussing more openly. Could these conflicts eventually lead to something much bigger? Of course, no one can say with certainty whether the world is truly moving toward a global war. The phrase World War III appears frequently in online discussions, but reality is always more complicated than dramatic headlines. At the same time, it is clear that we are living in a period where geopolitical tensions are once again increasing. Major powers are competing economically, militarily, and technologically. Alliances shift, global influence is constantly being negotiated, and regional conflicts sometimes become pressure points in a much larger global game. Another thing that raises many questions is the duration of these conflicts. The war in Ukraine has already lasted for several years, and during that time enormous amounts of money have been spent on weapons, military equipment, and logistical support. At the same time, tensions in other regions of the world continue to grow. And that leads to another uncomfortable question that many people begin to ask. Who actually benefits from these situations? Because while conflicts bring instability and suffering, they also create massive markets for certain industries. The defense industry, for example, often becomes extremely active during times like these. Military contracts increase, weapons production accelerates, and governments invest enormous amounts of money into security and defense. At the same time, energy markets become highly sensitive. Prices fluctuate rapidly, and energy resources once again become powerful strategic tools in global politics. I'm not saying that there is one simple explanation or some single hidden plan behind everything happening in the world. Geopolitics is far too complex to be reduced to a single theory. But I do think it is important to step back and try to look at the bigger picture. Because when tensions begin rising in multiple regions of the world at the same time, the impact is no longer just regional. It becomes global. And that is why discussions about global stability, about the balance between major powers, and about the direction our world is heading are becoming increasingly important. Maybe none of us can predict exactly what will happen in the years ahead. But one thing is clear. The world is entering a period where political decisions, regional conflicts, and rivalries between major powers will increasingly shape the lives of ordinary people everywhere. And when we step back and look at all of these events together, a much bigger picture begins to emerge. On one side of the world, tensions are rising again in the Middle East, a region that controls a significant portion of the energy that powers the global economy. On the other side, in Europe, a war between Russia and Ukraine has now been going on for years, reshaping political alliances and creating new economic pressures. At the same time, competition between major global powers is becoming more visible than it has been in decades. Military spending is increasing. Strategic resources like energy and technology are becoming central to geopolitical influence. And regional conflicts are once again drawing the attention of the entire world. From my perspective, what we are witnessing right now is not necessarily the beginning of a global war, but it is clearly a period where the balance of the world is becoming more fragile. In today's interconnected world, conflicts are no longer isolated events. An incident in one region can trigger economic reactions in another. Political decisions made in one capital can influence markets, trade routes, and energy prices across entire continents. That is why events in places like the Middle East or Eastern Europe should not be seen as distant problems that only affect those regions. They are part of a much larger system. A system where energy, security, economics, and global influence are deeply connected. And when pressure starts building in several parts of that system at the same time, the consequences can spread far beyond the original conflict. History has shown us that many of the biggest turning points in the world began with conflicts that initially seemed regional. Tensions between nations, energy crises, rivalries between major powers. At first they appear distant, but over time their effects reach far beyond the places where they started. Maybe the world is not heading toward a global war. Maybe these tensions will remain part of a complicated but controlled geopolitical landscape. But one thing is certain. We are living in a moment where the balance of the world is becoming increasingly fragile. And the real question may not only be what is happening today. The real question is, what comes next?